Today is Thursday, February 13th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with Mr. Wallace Smith, who wants to kick things off with an important announcement.
I do. This is actually this comes with an apology as well. We had meant to do this weeks ago, and I'm only now getting to it, but I do still think there's opportunity. First, a hats off to those who were at the camp in South Africa back in December, like a little more than a month ago. We heard from Mr. Luwadi Ferreira. We heard from Dr. Scott Winnell. You guys had a fun time, and just want to throw out some plugs for that. We have listeners all over the world. But I know they could use help from even in the U.S., in other countries. I think they would love to have the help at those camps. So just want to do a quick plug for the European LYP camp. There's camps that aren't just in the United States. Some of you looking for an opportunity to do something exciting in some other part of the world. So the European LYP camps, keep those in mind. Also, the South Africa camps. Those actually have different part of the world. They happen actually in December.
Our
looking for
Ben
something different.
Graham went to the South Africa and
Our
loved
own,
it.
That's right.
Had a great time.
He did right here out of editorial.
Yep.
We loaned him out for
That's
a
right.
brief little time. If you want to reach out concerning the European camp or the South African camp, you can email Mr. Reese Ellis at RELLIS at lcg.org, or you can email Mr. Ferreira at LFERREIRA at lcg.org. You can rewind that if you have to get
Tricky
that.
spelling.
But that's not what we're talking about for our podcast today. Today, we want to highlight that, Christ's return is not just about us. And we think that hopefully that today's program can help give people some perspective to turn that around.
I'll take some perspective, Mr. Smith.
Good. We all need perspective. Thank you, Jake and Julia. We appreciate it very much, and welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And we want to put in perspective what we're talking about here, and I hope it's really plain. I know, when I was young, I had plans. I didn't have as detailed a kind of plans as I really thought I had, but still, my future looked bright. I was excited about it, and I don't want to come across here at the beginning with the sense that that's wrong. And actually, let me defer to Mr. Robinson, because on this, I know I didn't even, me personally, I didn't think about Jesus Christ returning when I was young because I didn't know any better. This was before I was called. I was just in the world. The world was going forward. I'm thinking of, the future and space and technology and all sorts of things. But you actually grew up in the church. So
Right.
You've been hearing about Jesus Christ return since you were a wee little lad.
Yes.
Well, what's your perspective, Mr.
My
Robinson?
perspective was I heard about Christ's imminent return all the time. Now, imminent, let me put that in perspective, because the church very correctly teaches there's a timeline of events before Christ would return. Like, he's not going to just suddenly show up one night and not have fulfilled all kinds of things he said he was going to fulfill. Unlike other mainstream ministers who claim that, Christ what if he returned
Could
tonight?
happen
It was
tonight.
like, no, we know that's not going to happen that way. Okay, so to put it in perspective. But considering that I was born in 1971 and the church thought we were going to flee in 75, I think.
At least many did. Yeah.
Yeah, many, right. Well, not my uncle, apparently, because that's my father asked him about it, and he said, he had this whole timeline down of how if they conceived at a certain date and were born at a certain date, and you could wean on a certain date, and you'd avoid what we felt like was, woe to those who were pregnant and nursing in those days.
Right.
Laudable to take that seriously. But growing up, Christ was going to return was always out there. Always. It didn't even matter in some ways really where world conditions were, because looking back now, us mired in the Cold War in some ways made it the least likely thing that Christ was going to return right away. It's not until the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that actually opened up things again. But at first, in the 90s, there was a big boom. There's the first .com boom. And anyway, so here I am as a young man, and so I'm sympathetic to everybody out there who's an older teen or into your 20s, and you whether you were married or just got married, you feel like you have your life ahead of you, and especially if you're in the West in particular, you're in very prosperous countries. Man, you want to do what everybody did. You want to get married. You want to have your kids. When Mr. Weston was on, I was actually a little sympathetic to the man who'd gotten married and said he wanted to make his mark on the world. That is kind of programmed into the men to want to do those kinds of things, and the women are adjacent but slightly different. And so I felt that way. And again, you talked about serving up some perspective. Man, aging 30 more years puts a lot of perspective in your life, and realizing now, looking back, that while that was an understandable perspective to have, it kind of missed the larger point. And we should be able to understand this through our calling, which we talked about last week, as we're doing the work. Why are we doing the work? Because almost nobody in the world understands what the gospel means, what the coming kingdom of Christ means. And if we had it more firmly implanted in our head and didn't think about it in terms of actually disrupting our future, which is ironic because it's all about our future and it only gets better. We're going to need those sunglasses that you referred to. You didn't refer to it earlier. Your future was so bright, you're going to need sunglasses, and that's an 80s thing. So.
It is, except if you're going to reference it fully, you probably ought to say shades just to be spot on those. Yeah, my future's so bright.
You're going to need shades.
Yeah, that's right. Got to wear shades. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. That's very confirming for me, and I can sympathize. While I did come in when I was young, I started attending when I was 18. But still was already in the thick of life moving forward.
But that would really apply to you then. I mean, that's the age where you're 18, you hear this truth, and you're like, oh no, the new truth says I don't have a future because Christ is going to return, which is so ironic.
Well, what we'd like to highlight, and there's one take on this I know we've emphasized in the past, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want to fail to get it across. Overall, broadly, this whole shebang we're talking about today, it is a matter of perspective. Because when you really have the right perspective, there is nothing that you will want and recognize, I don't want Christ to return because of blank. There's not going to be any of that. When you really do understand, you might want more time to develop spiritually in some kind of way, but yet at the same time, overall, you want to put all of that into God the Father's hands and Christ by when he needs to come. But the more perspective you have, the more accurate perspective, the more you realize that, no, if it could happen today, I would want it today. I want Christ to return to this world. And the angle that I'll just kind of talk about here briefly at the beginning, before we look at the other side, I don't feel like we've covered quite as much, though I could be wrong. Mr. Wesson covered it in an article. In fact, I tried to find that article, Mr. Robinson. Maybe you can help me, but maybe later if we can find the article he wrote for the Living Church News that addresses it, I'll try to add a link to the livingyouth.org website. But the first angle is that if we want to achieve something in this life, that is marriage or children, or we want to learn to work at a particular job and develop a certain skill and see some success, first let me say, like in Mr. Robinson's case, that's not a bad thing. Right. It's a wonderful thing to want to be married. It's a wonderful thing to want to have children. It's a wonderful thing to want to learn to be productive and develop your skills. But at the same time, to think that desiring those things means I want to put off Christ's return so I can have them, it does show a lack of perspective, because everything that's on the other side of Christ's return is so much greater. All the joys of this life are simply a little sliver or a taste of the greatness and the fullness. The verse that came to mind is in Psalm 16. In Psalm 16, David has been talking about difficulties in life, etc., but he comes to this conclusion in verse 11 of Psalm 16. Speaking to God, he says, "You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." He recognized that the ultimate satisfaction in life really is in God's presence, that in that presence, that's where the joy is full and not lacking. That's where the pleasures are forevermore and not temporary. And it's important to recognize that even the finest and most wonderful of experiences and things in this physical life, at its best, is merely a shadow or a reflection of a mere reflection of the fullness that God wants to give us. My example I'll go to, and Mr. Robinson, you can be up front and tell me if this is a terrible example in front of all these people. It won't bother me. But I still like macaroni and cheese for the record.
No judgment.
No, thank you. I don't eat as much of it as I used to because I don't want the figure I used to have. I enjoy being thinner and healthier these
You
days.
just got to run the numbers. You can have some.
That's right. Exactly. I know how many calories there are. I got an app to help me find that. So I know how much I can have when it's available. I'm not going to get 14 helpings, I'm going to get a little bit, but let's say, I never had it before and I haven't yet discovered this love for macaroni and cheese that I now have. So, let's say someone gave me just a sliver. I mean, they took some macaroni and cheese, they took a noodle, and they trimmed this tiny slice off of a noodle that had a little bit of the cheese. It's just enough to taste, and that's it. And then they gave me some of that. And I thought, oh, I like that. I like that flavor. I think I like the texture too, though I could barely feel the texture because there's barely anything there. But I like that. And someone said, well, hey, guess what? This is dinner. I got like a bowl. It's oh no. I just want another sliver, right? Is that
right?
Well, that would be that.
Yeah,
that shows I'm missing something,
Yeah.
right? And what God, everything, the best, the 100% best things of this life that are godly, that He grants us in this life, they're nothing but. Even calling them a sliver is an exaggeration. When we understand that perspective, and you have to understand it intellectually, in most cases, I think, before you learn to embrace it in a larger way. When we do understand that, then we recognize, well, no, I want Christ to return. I don't want the shadows. If it's time to replace the shadows with the reality, then 100% give me the reality.
Yeah.
So when you understand that perspective, I think it makes a difference. When I say those things, that's kind of from the perspective of the converted, those who are expecting to be transformed when Christ returns. But it is also more than just that. In the millennium, people will be getting married. People will be building families, right? Those things are going to happen. But in which world would you rather marry? I'm not saying don't put off marriage in this life. No, go for it. I think now is the time to try to build a strong family, right? That can endure the things to come. But at the same time, if you had a choice, Mr. Robinson, to be, say, 20-something, young 20-something, not yet married, and I were going to drop you before the millennium to, get married, build a family, or I'm going to drop you in the millennium to get married and build a family, which spot would you pick?
I mean, there's no comparison. I mean, I'm going to want to drop into the millennium because why? Like, let's put aside that, the idea that Christ is going to return and create a paradise on earth, which I do think is, you choose different ways to describe it, but essentially it's going to happen.
That's definitely a way to describe it, yeah.
To be dropped into an area, and we in the West, again, I don't know, maybe if you lived in Europe and you were old enough to have been in World War II, let's say, you probably would feel differently. But in general, we have not had our countries invaded, especially I think of the U.S., even though England fought the Battle of Britain, that people don't invade England. My point is to feel true safety and true abundance because, it says the reaper will overtake the plower, right?
Right.
And the harvest is so amazing that you can't even get it all out of the ground before it's time to start the next harvest. But even more important than that, to live in a society. So what do we say the three S's are? I wonder if we actually emphasize that with our young listeners.
I've actually thought about having an article in the Living Church News. It's been a long time since we've really emphasized it, and it's a classic understanding. Yep. I know where you're going.
The three S's: Satan, self, and society. And right now we battle all three. But what about in the millennium? Guess what? Satan's been bound and he doesn't influence things anymore. So Satan's out of the picture. Society, no longer under the influence of Satan, it now becomes a society that is driven by Christ.
Yeah, restructured according to God's laws and designs.
So you tell me, dear listener, to live in the millennium where you have a society that is for you and supports your values and family-driven values, it's going to be 10 times easier to raise your family, and it'll be far more enjoyable. So, and the thing is, this is the other thing I thought of. We can firmly say that the Great Tribulation of the Day of the Lord is 3.5 years. So let's round it off to 5 years. I mean, all you're really skipping out in is a 5-year period before things return to normal.
Yeah, if that were to happen. And even Mr. Wesson has said, and others I've said, it's like there's, even if we're in the place of safety, that doesn't mean there's not marriages possibly happening there and stuff. It's like, so in other words, there's no reason that we have to worry about such things. You really can give yourself over to the hand of God and just be excited about Christ returning, and hope that he returns soon, because things get better
Yes.
in every way once he's back.
Yeah, I remember talking to one of my kids who, it wasn't actually a big concern, but we just talked about it and the pros and cons. And I said, well, you're X age now, and 3.5 years from now, you'll be X age from now. But think about how dramatically the picture's turned. So what do we like to do as a family? Well, we've always enjoyed traveling. Like a lot of stuff we like is not unique to us. You like finding a neat town that has a neat place to go get coffee and a cool place to go get something to eat, and just, we always enjoyed that kind of thing. In my mind, when Christ returns, sets up his society on earth and his rule, you don't think we're going to have those things? You don't think that? In fact, there will be more of them, and they'll be even more amazing. Just the lifestyle changes will be so extensive that we'll just be amazed that we will sit there in the millennium and wonder why we ever wanted things to keep going before his return.
Nobody during the millennial reign of Christ, and it's good for me to talk about these things. We are going to get to the other point here eventually, because the TWPs these days do kind of focus in a special way on that with the new theme that we have in terms of how beyond the chaos, there's this beautiful things coming. But no one during the millennial is going to think, man, if only we go back to the old times, right? No one's going to do that. In fact, what you're saying, you talk about coffee shops, I guess that means a Starbucks in every city, Mr. Robinson. Is that what you're saying? The world's greatest coffee company? And I'm just kidding. I'm exaggerating.
Well,
we're not sponsored by Starbucks, by the way.
No shade to Starbucks. In fact, I saw a independent coffee guy one time say, Starbucks gets a lot of hate. He said, but you try supplying 40 billion coffee locations with adequate coffee. That would be tough to do just because of the scale. But, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but some of the neat things about traveling through Europe, and there's one year we went to the feast in France that it was in a location they would probably never have it again. And it was very rural, which meant that it still had a lot of older family farms and older traditions. And,
Okay.
and the bartender there, it was more than just a bar. You'd have to see it to understand. He had this grappa he offered me a taste of that was only made in that area and had been made by his family for generations. So to me, instead of what's happened with globalism, where everything started to become the same, basically, imagine traveling through areas and everything was just a little different, a little unique. Another thing I liked about France is there's so many regional cheeses. Each area has their thing that they're good at, and just, I don't know. To me, the variety of things coming will be amazing.
I don't even know what a grappa is, and I'm already excited. I do think that it's so funny. We have a culture. We have a society in which people, they claim to be excited about diversity and about differences, when really, if you really scratch just below the surface, it's a monoculture that's being pressed on everybody. They have Starbucks trying to encourage diversity by being the same everywhere, and such, versus there, you're right. You're going to have truly local feel and flavor here and there. And it actually becomes, that's part of the irony. By coming and enforcing godly standards on the entire world, for the first time, the blessings of actual diversity of region and locale is actually going to blossom. Okay, you can tell Mr. Robinson and I are getting excited about the millennium. So keeping those things in mind, that's actually not our focus. We're minute 20 or so, Mr. Robinson. We focus on our actual theme, because there's another element to this as well. And this is not, I hope nobody feels this. None of this is meant to make someone feel guilty. We're not making anybody feel guilty. If anything, it's a little bit of, in my case, a little bit of a confession. Some of you may not realize this, but I am an American. I don't know if I've said that out loud or not, but anyway.
I don't think we've officially stated that we are Americans.
I think most people know we live here in Charlotte, our headquarters, but regardless, here's my point. I have, and this does enter my own prayers actually quite a bit. I do try to thank God for such things. If you think of randomly a person in the world, I thought it'd be a wonderful spreadsheet to make one day if I get the data together to actually randomize a human. That is, if you were to pluck a random person off of the planet out of the 8 billion people, truly randomly, as in no preference for geography or for sex or for wealth, anything, what would that random person look like? If you could just do that several times, I'd love to build a spreadsheet that does that. But I know in my case, I'm an American. I was born in Kentucky, moved very quickly, my family did, to Texas, where my dad was from. Grew up in Texas, great state. other than traveling outside the United States here and there. I've grown up my whole life in America. And in terms of just being randomly born in the world as an American, in many ways, even in some of our most difficult decades recently, it's like winning the lottery. It's like, I mean, you have been born into a nation sitting atop the world. It doesn't recognize it's due to the blessings given to Abraham, but that is exactly why. And what an amazing privilege that is. And as a result, my worst days over the last 50 some odd years are better than the best days of many people in the world, even today. And as a result, I have to be mindful that my perspective can be a bit off. It's easy for me to pray about Christ returning soon because of things I want to see fixed in my life or in the world immediately around me. Or, oh boy, look at Disney Plus these days. I can't believe they're airing stuff like that, man. Oh, I want Christ return to fix Disney Plus, as dumb as that sounds. But yeah, I can see signs of decay and moral decay and difficulty around me. But what I need to gain, and we hope all of you will, at least some of you already have, perhaps better than us. Some of you are living in some of these countries. But we want to encourage you to have another perspective. And that is to remember that Christ's return is not just about you, and it's not just about me. And the more you think of the difficulties going on in the rest of the world, which most of you are not experiencing, though some of you truly are. Some of you might be. You live in a country that has, or in your background you have. When you actually get a global perspective, which is the kind of perspective that, of course, God and Jesus Christ has, then all the more you recognize we need Christ to return now. There are terrible difficulties and sufferings in the world, and that Christ's return is not just about me. It's about the entire rest of the world and what the world actually needs. And that's something we're not going to try to be morbid and talk about a whole lot of things in depth, because honestly, if you go into the depth, into the trials and sufferings of the world, it'll ruin your month, if not your year. It's just the world is a place filled with astonishing suffering. But we do want to touch on some ideas to help give that kind of perspective. And that's the perspective we want to address here on the podcast today.
Yes. You know what I got from all of that, Mr. Smith?
What?
Is you're not a native Texan.
I was born in Kentucky.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm an implant. I'm 50-50. My mom's from Kentucky. My dad was from Texas.
You have to get that bumper sticker that says, I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could.
True story. So I remember back when I was pastoring in St. Louis, I think, Mr. Ben Graham, who's on our editorial team, he had a blog at the time, if I recall. Blogging was a thing.
It was.
Did, I did. And I remember, I can't remember something, but he, on one of his posts, I don't know if he even brought it to my attention. He might have. He was talking about, he's like, oh, Texans, man, they just... they're just so stuck up on their state, like they're better than everybody. And I remember reading it, and I think I made a little fun of him because I do that a lot, but also had to recognize, that's kind of true.
Yeah,
it is kind of true.
Sometimes people come to Texas and they don't get it, and that's fine. Okay, but I will support you, by the way. Back to trying to be serious again. Sorry about that. You're 100% correct. I was listening to, I had a summer where I was listening to a prominent historical podcaster.
Okay.
Very well regarded, goes in depth, listened to a lot of history podcasts, loved it. I always loved the history. In fact, my brief foray into college, I was a history major. And he said there was only one other time in human history where he would consider living other than this one. And it was like 16th or 17th century feudal Japan.
Really?
They'd finally gotten a handle on, they weren't warring in Japan as much. And so the samurai, who really did try to be noble, actually, in fact, they had a bit of an identity crisis because they weren't fighting so much anymore. So what would they do? And it was a relatively peaceful time in Japan, and Japan was really protected by being an island nation.
Kind of like we are in a sort of island, not an island continent, you know what I'm saying? But yeah.
Because I would challenge anybody who's maybe disenchanted with living here in this time period and saying, well, here's how it was back there and then. I mean, I would just challenge you to do an in-depth historical study of that time and find out if you really would like to live then. What were women's rights like back then? Could you own private property? All kinds of things that we take for granted living in the U.S. and living in the West, those kinds of things. We have lived in a true golden age, and I do believe the other side of Christ's return, we'll look back on this and think, why did, again, why were we so tied to this? You and I have talked about this, and with Trump's reelection has made us think about this again. What is he doing for America? Is he improving America? Some people have thought, well, is there going to be I would never use this term in the best of conditions, but is there a new golden age for America ahead? And if you're living in America, you would want things to go well and run smoothly. I mean, and I think it's Christ that admonishes us to, maybe it's Paul, pray for our leaders, hope that we can, and pray that we live peaceable lives. Like,
Right.
we do want things to go smoothly. But then I realized, when I analyzed my own what do you call that? My own motivations.
Okay.
And I would love for the rest of my life to go smooth, but not at the expense of Christ's return. Christ's return should trump every one of our desires, because it affects more than just us. What about, as you were alluding to, what about the other people on the earth who don't have such abundance as we do? What about people who are in very difficult situations? I think it's off the coast of Sri Lanka. The West dumps their big boats they don't need anymore, and they go in there and they tear them apart, and it's terribly dangerous, and there's lots of toxic chemicals that come out of them. But that's what they got to do to make a living.
Right.
And on and on and on. People don't live great lives.
That's something, and I've barely gotten into it, but my wife has looked at some things and showed me some articles and studies that especially here in, say, the U.S., we don't recognize. It's easy to say, look at our cities, how clean they are. They are not necessarily clean. Things are getting pretty rough. But regardless, look at this wonderful lifestyle we have. But we don't always see, and some of you, our listeners, we do have international listeners. We appreciate just how many people all over the world actually do listen here in our youth. But that's where a lot of our garbage goes. It's like we don't see it all here. Yeah, we have landfills here and there, but a good example, my wife was just astonished when she read about it, when it comes to the fashion industry. How do they keep some of these name brands so expensive? Well, what they do is, when the season goes, when the year is out and they're going to come out with a new line, they will make sure that they don't let their clothes go off onto the cheap racks, because they don't want their stuff getting out for a low price. They will take it, even though it is 100% waste, and they go out in some, like, certain deserts and stuff, and they just dump all of this clothes, which is filled with, frankly, microplastics, a lot of synthetic fibers. But you have places in the world that have these vast dumps of high-end, super expensive clothing that it's like we don't see any of that. We don't see all of our garbage heaps. We don't see the place where these boats are dumped, etc. Because America is a powerful enough nation. We decide we don't want to see those things. We want to make sure other people are kind of burned. Now, I'm not trying to come across like we're the bad guys in all of this. What I'm trying to say, because there's a lot of good that we do as well. The point is not who's bad and who's good. The point is having a proper perspective on the world and actually realizing that life is not this good, like we enjoy it, like it is so many other places. So we'll just pick a smattering of examples. Consider, for instance, and we'll not linger too terribly on any of these because it's just, you get into really dark places, but consider human trafficking and child trafficking in particular. That is a real thing, even here in the United States, where people are moved from place to place against their will for activities and purposes that they do not want to participate in. It bothers me, but it bothers me for right reasons. When I'm, say, in an airport in the U.S. and I just go in to wash my hands, whatever, in between flights, making a connection, and there's a little sticker on the wall that has to say, "Hey, if you're being trafficked, please call this number,
right.
and let someone know."
Yeah.
Why? Because that is going on. It's a huge industry. And you think, well, I'm glad the United States doesn't participate in that. Well, then you aren't thinking clearly. That what drives that? Money drives that, right? And guess where money is located? There's a lot of money in the United States. But looking at some statistics, if you look at those who are trafficked in the world, at least by one source, and by the way, we might mention a lot of statistics today. I'm going to go ahead and non-qualify that and say we're not going to waste a lot of time giving a lot of sources. And if our sources are wrong, we apologize. If it's worse or better, these are still facts of the world, and hopefully the.
Do we have a disclaimer guy?
I should have. I don't think he has recorded a particular statement that'll fit for that, but we'll sort of have that serve as a disclaimer.
But you make a great point. Even if we don't have all the details exactly right, this is going on.
Oh, these are real facets of the world, absolutely. So one of those facts that did seem to come from a decent source, if I recall, was how many of the trafficked victims in the world actually are children. Just children who have no control over anything in their lives. They're trafficked for labor. They're trafficked, frankly, for sexual exploitation. Child soldiering. It's easy not to think of that, but that is a huge market in the world, to have children that you can conscript into your armies. All these conflicts going on in the world, they don't always talk about how many of the actual people fighting literally are children that are forced to take a gun, to go. You know why? Because, well, so our children can pull triggers and kill people. And if we lose a child, I can just go get some more. And also the other side is more likely to trust a child, right? So you give them a bomb, they might be able to go further. There's so much to go into. But understand that's a reality that my children, for instance, I'm so grateful they don't know anything close to any of that in terms of personal experience. But you go out into the world, and for some whole countries, you have parents praying every day that their child doesn't fall into the things that they know their neighbors' children were taken for, et cetera.
Yeah, no. I mean, we could really go on about that, because if you watch the news in Africa in particular, so clearly certain nations are much more stable than others. Like, for instance, I've talked about going to the feast in Kenya. That's really quite a stable nation. You don't run into this. But in other ones that maybe have a warlord overseeing things, one tribe or one village goes over and butchers another village that's a different tribe, and then they take the kids. And anyway, it's just an ugly scene. And, even here in the United States, over the last 4 years, with the border really being pretty wide open, I saw this estimate all over the place. And one day I did some research to find out if this was, say, a talking point of one group, or if this seemed to be generally accepted. And what I found was this figure was generally accepted. There were 325,000 unaccompanied minors unaccounted for.
Wow.
So very common coming, and it tends to not to be Mexican so much anymore. I think they tend to come from Central America or South America. There's actually does not seem to be as much migration from Mexico proper into the U.S. It's other Latin American countries. They pay the money, and their kids are sent across the border unaccompanied, except maybe by a cartel, and then they get into the country and they disappear. There was no tracking of them.
Yeah, that's it. That's it's. Boy, the news mishandles everything based on its own biases. Let me step into some things that might sound political, but are not political. In fact, hopefully it'll be very obvious I'm not being political. In fact, if we are going to talk about something political, this would be a good opportunity for Disclaimer Guy. We haven't trotted him out in a while, so Disclaimer Guy, why don't you help everybody understand our perspective when it comes to politics?
The Living Church of God does not involve itself in politics. Any resemblance between the comments that follow and getting involved in politics is purely coincidental, or is a figment of your imagination. Control yourself.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. We always appreciate your contribution, because we're going to say some things that are going to talk about politics, but we're not political. So look, for instance, at what's going on currently under the Trump administration with Mr. Musk, and just picking on USAID. I know people say USAID, USAID. I just say USAID. I treat it like that. So you have a part of the government through which a ton of money is being funneled to various places and groups and organizations around the world. Well, on one side, you have those who are highlighting things like being sent to transgender theater productions in a different country, and trying to press for homosexual DEI, kind of training here and there. A lot of things that a lot of Americans are discovering, well, that's odious to me. That I can't believe that this much money is being sent to these different kinds of things. And so you have some lamenting that and saying, "Hey, we gotta shut it all down." Then you have others, and now whether they're very possibly a small percentage of all this, but still you have others I've seen that are legitimate aid organizations. Some of these actually like sincere people that themselves they're not taking in, they're volunteers, and they're handing out rice, to individuals, and all they know is that's the money paying for that. You're looking at USAID, and it's paying for that. and they're trying to help people stay alive in various areas. Whether that's the wisest way to approach it, I'm not trying to knock. These are just people of sincere compassion. They're trying to help. They're not politicians, and they see that money potentially drying up, and they're terrified, right? Well, these people are just going to starve, because this is literally the source for them right now. And then the media you listen to depends on which take they want to have. Are they cheerleaders for the dismantling, or do they think it's terrible? And so, well, they'll only give you the examples, right? One, if you step back and look at both sides, you would still agree this is messed up, right? If I have $10 of tax money going to charitable organizations, I'd like to know that's actual charities, for instance, and actually helping people if it's doing that, and not going to terrorists, or not going to enforce moral rot, and force other countries. You may not like it, but we're paying people in your country, to spread this kind of stuff. And so you're looking at having to turn off the spigot completely to try to evaluate everything. And maybe you can add some things back. But even just looking at all of that is a good sign of how absolutely messed up the world is. And knowing that there are places that if it wasn't for money from some Western countries, like, have no doubt about it. It's easy to kind of go rah, rah, rah and get behind efforts like this politically. Because yes, there are some terrible things that will be shut down when they have no more money, because they just have no more money. What are they going to do? They've been not only taking this money, but building big salaries, et cetera. But there's also places where people will no longer have food. That is going to happen. Even in the best case scenario, for a certain amount of time, that's going to happen as well, because the world around us is terrible and it is broken. And so those situations really it's not all a good thing or all a bad thing. It's like everything else in this world. It's a mixture of good and evil, like everything is. And it's so easy to think, I'm in America and I love seeing this thing be fixed. But then recognize there are a lot of other people, which you're going to seem like the worst person in the world, that this is all that was keeping my family alive. We're so grateful. And we know the warlords take half of it, and we know that other people are being enriched by it. But at the same time, the only reason I have some rice in my spoon today, is because of that. It's just a messed up world, and we need Jesus Christ to fix it all.
What a good way of juxtapositioning that argument, if you will. I mean, you're right. If it's full of corruption, that's a problem. If it's full of exporting, the United States through this method and into NGOs, we export perversion around the world, unfortunately.
That's right.
But then, okay, some good people get hurt along the way. Well, why are they in a bad position? Well, they're in a position where, for whatever reason, they can't have enough food. There's war. War is actually quite commonly the biggest problem. Sometimes it's environmental, but either way, we have a problem, and the solution, as you said, was, of course, the return of Christ.
Right, and wanting to put off Christ's return is like wanting to not actually fix those things. Also, this is actually transition to something else that also could be really political, and that's like, well, it relates to borders, for instance, because we're going to talk about refugees and such. And it's very easy to think one side or the other. Like, there are the extremes on one side that say there should be no borders whatsoever. We should just have a completely open world. Frankly, if you listen to the current Pope Francis, he tends to think that way. I was reading just yesterday of some Catholic writers who are just not happy with their Pope, and already looking forward to the next one in that case.
I read just this morning that the Pope is beginning to weigh in on the border crisis in the United States, and is actually quite critical of what Donald Trump has done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He kind of fits a little more this kind of attitude that's risen in the Catholic Church since Vatican II, that is far more, borders are bad, if anything, laws. But there's we don't want to be distracted by this, but there is a large and growing group of Roman Catholics that are like, yeah, that's garbage. We're glad that God has protected our church by not letting you say dumb things from the actual official chair, and then when you die, we have hopefully a good Pope coming. So that's very interesting dynamic.
I do. We always say this, okay? So this is not original, but I do think it'll be notable when it's time to pick another pope, because it's such a unique time. Like, he's not in good health. He wasn't in good health when they elected him. So, in his age, that there's going to be a new pope is not at all implausible. But the world is in a weird spot right now.
A very weird spot. So you have that, but then at the same time, looking at and we're talking about child trafficking and a lot of these terrible things that Mr. Robinson was mentioning some details as well. The border crisis only encourages that. When you look at the cartels and those that run people across the border, there's prices to be paid. There's so much. It's just a cover for so much illegal activity, and a lot of that is Mr. Robinson had some figures off the top of his head a while ago. I can't remember, and how many children are just disappearing into other countries.
325,000.
Yeah,
unaccounted for,
unaccompanied, unaccompanied, maybe accompanied by a cartel member or someone, but not their parents.
Yeah. I mean, maybe a few of them get into a better place, but where do you think the majority of these kids are going?
That's right. So that kind of moves also into the refugee crisis. And I say refugee crisis like it's just one crisis, but I mean the whole condition of refugees and refugee camps. I did write an article about that, about the kind of illusion of having a borderless world, and so it's a cover article in Tomorrow's World magazine. We'll try to point to that. But I remember getting a letter from someone who said, you just sound like a Republican or a capitalist or something. And it was clear the fella didn't actually read the article, because nowhere does it say, because he was trying to say, we should care about these people. The article talks about that. It's so easy to just judge some of these people that are trying to get across the border, even illegally. I'm not saying we should ignore the laws. I'm just talking about looking at the human. It's so easy to just judge them as, oh, what a terrible criminal. But not all of these people, but some of them, if you understand the circumstances in which they're living and what they see their children, like, when are the guerrillas going to show up and grab their daughter, for entertainment purposes? When are they going to come and grab their son and press him into service? And they start to draw certain conclusions and say, look, I don't care what it takes. I am going to do my best to try to find a better circumstance in which to live. I was looking at just some statistics. And in Syria, for instance, it's been in the news a lot in terms of the taking care of Bashad, those kind of circumstances in Syria and bringing that to a close. The conflict in Syria, it's been estimated, has made homeless, essentially, 14 million people. And you think 14 million people, well, it's so difficult because those just seem like statistics. With numbers like that, it's hard to actually take personally. In the U.S. population, that would be about 4% of the population. And you think, well, then what does that actually mean? Of all the states in the United States, there's only 4 of them, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, that have populations larger than that. So the other 46 states of the United States, each of them individually, those 14 million displaced people in Syria would become the 5th largest state in the entire country. Wow. And so think about it, like North Carolina, I can't remember North Carolina's population. Maybe it's 13 million, somewhere around there. Mr. Ross will try to look at it real quickly. Yeah. I think it's around 13 million. I could be wrong, but it's less than that 14 million. And imagine, so I'm sitting here thinking, what if literally every single person in my state had no home, no place to put their heads, you don't have a guaranteed source of food or anything, and you take that entire population. Let alone, I did look up a statistic. I'm trying to get it from memory. I'm going to be close. I'm going to get it exactly right, Mr. Robinson. But how many people, on average, if I asked you, hey, Mr. Robinson, how many people do you know by name? Do you know how many would be curious?
I'm so appallingly bad with names, and it's just laziness in my brain. I need to work so much harder. I don't know, but let's be, probably 50 people.
Oh, wow. I can give a statistic. And of course, I give a statistic. This is literally something I Googled in like 2 minutes, like 2 hours ago or so. And so maybe someone else will look it up after the podcast and look and say, wow, you are so wrong. I just looked this up. But that statistic suggested that each of us, on average, by name, knows about 660 people.
Really?
661, even, I think, something like that.
Now, they didn't account for Mike DeSimone, who is the most remarkable name rememberer person I've ever met.
But they might, but I don't know, they might be considering even famous people right? It could be like that. Like the name Brad Pitt, right? I mean, I know that, but I don't. But
I didn't think about it like that.
But even if you look at that, if you think about literally every human potentially being maybe 660 people compared to 14 million, and now you talk about people that they don't have a place. They have children. They have families. They have literal needs. I'm not trying to be gross, but you got to go to the bathroom.
Yep.
You've got to. You need food.
Yeah.
And being displaced from your home, relying on either refugee camp situations, which is not good. Talk about trafficking.
Yep.
Talk about terrible circumstances, or just being completely on your own.
You were right, by the way. North Carolina's population is 11,046,000.
Okay, I was thinking 13 million. I'm off. So about 11.5 million.
South Carolina is 5.3 million.
Wow, interesting. That's about half. Okay, so given that, there are circumstances all over the world. I did grab a UN page, and I know the UN. Some of you don't want to hear it just because it's the UN. But even if their numbers are halfway close on some of these things, consider it. It mentions that across the world, in terms of men, women, and children being displaced like that by conflict or by just simply drought conditions or hunger, about 120 million people all over the world. You're getting close to, like, say, half the population of the entire United States. About 1.5% of all humanity being displaced by violence or conflict or persecution, it mentions.
Yep.
And that does include even, say, areas in the U.S. here and there, not like by conflict and such, but where you do have situations where things are starting to get pretty terrible, and even their own vices having pressed them into the street. And it's easy to think, well, they need to, some of those people just need to, even like, say, in the United States, the homeless, well, they need to fix their circumstances. Where some that have gone so far down the spiral, there's no fixing, right? They don't know what to do. They don't have the capacity, perhaps, I'd say capacity, like the wherewithal, if you will. But it's easy to blame some of these countries. Like most of the poverty, well, I think, oh boy, do I have that statistics? I hope I do, because I don't want to get this wrong. I was reading about poverty, for instance, and that apparently you have sub-Saharan Africa, which is home to 16% of the world's population, according to worldbank.org. But in terms of the burden of extreme poverty, those globally considered to be in extreme poverty, 2/3 of them live in that region. And it's so easy to think, well, they need to discover the American way. You pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, I appreciated the experience that I had once at a place called, I think it's the Heritage Foundation is what it was called. And it was very enlightening in terms of just how probable it is someone can pick themselves up by their bootstraps. And that is not something you can do just anywhere. One, you have to have some kind of resources. You have to have something to work with to make your life better. And even if you invent something, even if you discover something, in a lot of those places, it's not like you suddenly have rights to that. You discover a new way to heat your family's home so that you and your family aren't cold, and maybe it's some little thing you've invented. Well, you're not going to get to patent that or anything. Your government's going to take that. It's like, well, thank you. We will have that.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, they've got it.
Yeah. And then they sue you for using your invention.
That's right. And they take maybe even the resources that you discovered you could make that with. So the idea that people of the world could just pick themselves up by their bootstraps is an illusion. That is an absolute falsehood.
Yeah. What a great point. And that's even come home to the church. I think we've mentioned Haiti before, and the members there. Like, do you know how many times I've gone to the feast where I hear gunshots being fired all day? Like, never. Like, there's just situations I've never been in, and I don't want to try to summarize the situation more than just what we've heard reported. But going to the feast, not being able to go to the feast one day because there was people fighting over the streets.
Right. Like you step outside and there's gunfire going around and realize, maybe we need to stay in today.
And we had members that had to flee their village because the army or the rebels were coming through and trying to take the young men and force them into military service. So
yeah, we did have those things about Myanmar or Burma. So it depends on who you're talking to in terms of what they call it. But yeah. And so hopefully this discussion has helped a little bit. When you look at Jesus Christ's model prayer, I still trained growing up to call it just the Lord's Prayer. The Lord had many prayers in the Bible, but the model prayer that he gave to his disciples when they asked him to teach them how to pray, it's interesting how the kingdom is mentioned twice, in that. There's the ending, where he says, yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory. And then also at the beginning when he says, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. There's a highlight there. It's really an example of Matthew 6:33 that we're to have the kingdom first in our mind. The kingdom should be at the front of our minds in many ways. It's something we should care about, something we should pray about. And Jesus Christ specified there that when you go to your Father, it should be an element of that prayer that you ask him to send his kingdom, that your kingdom would come. And as Mr. Robinson and I have been talking about, it's easy when we live in countries like we do, like he and I get to here in the United States, to not think about it from the perspective of the rest of the world. But But ask God to help you have that perspective, and ask Him rather to help you pray your kingdom come with meaning and with conviction, recognizing that it's not all about us. It really is about trying to save a world that is desperately, desperately in need of saving.
Smith and Robinson.